Okay, thank you so much to everyone for coming today. My name is Tyler Jose. I'm an assistant professor in Watson Institute and the Department of Political Science. It's my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Zack Cooper, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies U.S. strategy in Asia, including alliance dynamics and U.S.-China competition. He also teaches at Princeton University and co-hosts the Net Assessment podcast on the War on the Rocks, where I understand you mainly talk about how you were right and Ryan Evans was wrong in that war game like 5 years ago. Dr. Cooper is currently writing a book that explains how militaries change during power shifts. Before joining AEI, Dr. Cooper was a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's held previous positions at the German Marshall Fund, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, as well as policy positions inside of the National Security Council and Department of Defense. He's published widely, both in academic journals as well as public-facing form, and is the co-editor of 2 books, the first of which is entitled Post-War Japan and then Strategic Japan, both out in 2017 and 2014, respectively. He earned his PhD from Princeton University, as well as a BA in public policy from Stanford University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zack Cooper.
So I'm really happy to be here. We've talked about doing this for a little while, and COVID made it slightly difficult. So I'm really glad to get a chance to chat with all of you, and mostly looking forward to the discussion. So I was joking with Tyler a second ago. He's got his red folder, and as some of you may have seen during Hu Jintao's ushering out of the party congress a few weeks ago, having a red folder and reading or attempting to read what's inside of it can be a dangerous thing to do now. So that's sort of what I want to attempt to do, is to try and decipher some of what's going on, not necessarily in China, because I'm not a China expert, but I do spend a lot of time on the US-China relationship and talking both with the Chinese, but also with a lot of other countries in Asia about what's going on in the US-China relationship and the US-Asia relationship more broadly. So that's really what I want to talk about today. And I think the place to start is probably that 2023, I think, is going to be maybe the most difficult year in US-China relations, probably since, I don't know, the 1970s. I would say it's shaping up to be even harder than Tiananmen was in the US-China bilateral relationship. So I want to sketch out why that's the case, at least in my view, what it means for where we're going, and then talk a little bit about some research I've been doing that is related to this question of timeframes. So I think, as all of you know, the US-China relationship has been pretty bad for about 5 years. Some people are going to blame Donald Trump for starting this. I think the Trump administration would blame the Chinese for starting this. But at the end of the day, we all know that the last 5 years has been really difficult, right? We've had a trade war. We've had lots of bilateral meetings that have gone quite poorly. We are in a bit of a technology war at the moment. And there's just very little trust between the two governments. And in fact, there's so little trust that I think both sides are a little bit scared. I was saying this to Tyler on the way over. The fact that Xi Jinping and Joe Biden just met and had a relatively positive meeting, all things considered, this is news, right? The fact that they were willing to smile at each other and actually shake hands in public, this all of a sudden is news. 6 years ago, wouldn't have been a big deal. But now, just even having in-person meetings feels like a step forward. They didn't accomplish anything in the meeting, right? And we can go into more detail if you'd like on exactly what happened. I have a little bit of insight. So they didn't get anything done in the meeting, but the fact that they were actually able to meet, and that unlike their meeting, the meeting between some of the senior leadership a year and a half ago in Anchorage, they weren't yelling at each other in front of TV cameras. This seems like a success. So why did they meet? And what does it mean for 2023? So what both sides have said a lot publicly is that they're trying to set a floor under the relationship. And what they mean by this, right, is that, so you can think of this like there's a ceiling, which is how good can the relationship get, how high can it go, and there's a floor, which is how bad can it get, how low can it go, And so we're not talking about how far can the US-China relationship go in terms of how high can we climb. We're talking about trying to put a floor under it to make sure it doesn't get significantly worse, right? That's what the two leaders are trying to do. And why do we need a floor? Frankly, because next year is going to be really tough. And I'll give you 3 reasons why I think that's going to be the case. The first is, as some of you may have seen yesterday, Kevin McCarthy looks like he's likely to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. We won't know for sure until early next year, but he's the odds-on favorite. He is likely to do what Nancy Pelosi did in August. He's likely to take a trip to Taipei, probably early next year. And he has said, his people have said, that he is probably going to take a large delegation, maybe dozens of members of Congress, to Taiwan. So if you think the Chinese didn't appreciate Nancy Pelosi going, wait till you see dozens of Republican members of Congress landing in Taipei. And oh, by the way, Kevin McCarthy has also been signaling that he might say some pretty, what I'll call, forward-leaning things about his support for Taiwan's independence or for Taiwan's sovereignty. So these are things that Nancy Pelosi did not do when she went to Taiwan. And the Chinese have been quite explicit that they would be extremely upset if this would occur, and that they will likely do things even beyond what they did in response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year, or earlier this year, sorry. So challenge number 1 is how can we manage a potential visit by the Speaker of the House to Taiwan? What would China do in response? What will Taiwan do? And then what will the Biden administration do? And I'll come back to that in just a second. The second stressor in the relationship is that as of last night, I guess, we've started the 2024 presidential election. And China's going to be a pretty big issue in it. Now, for most of us political scientists, we all know that voters don't really care that much about foreign policy. But that doesn't stop campaigns from talking a fair amount about foreign policy, right? And I think China is going to be maybe the top issue on foreign policy, and it's the one issue that there's broad agreement in Washington about. Now Republicans don't really agree necessarily on whether we should support Ukraine as much as we have been. The two parties don't agree on Middle East policy, like Iran, Saudi Arabia. It's not clear that either party really has strong views on Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. But the one area that there is pretty clear bipartisan support is for tougher policies on China. And as a result, I think you're going to hear lots of commitments by presidential candidates, probably both Republicans and Democrats, pushing the envelope on China issues, and in particular on Taiwan. And I would guess that most of this will come from Republicans, but not all, right? And as a reminder, the 2 things that the Chinese were most upset about in the last year both came from congressional Democrats. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei, and then something called the Taiwan Policy Act, which was pushed by Robert Menendez, a Democratic senator from New Jersey. So issue number 2, we're heading into a presidential cycle, and China's going to be pretty high up on the list of issues. And then I think the third challenge is going to be that there is an election in Taiwan in January 2024. And we don't know exactly who the key candidates are going to be, but I would put my money on William Lai, who is the vice president right now in Taiwan. Historically, some of the most difficult periods in US-China relations have been around elections in Taiwan. And this is setting up to be a particularly difficult election for 2 reasons. The first is that there is no longer much of a constituency that is supportive of Taiwan becoming part of mainland China. There used to be a lot of supporters in the KMT party, but now actually there's a pretty big debate within the KMT in Taiwan about whether they should actually go in the same direction that the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, has gone, and basically support not independence, but moving further away from China. And so the challenge here, I think, is going to be that you're going to have two political parties in Taiwan, neither of which has an incentive to try and do things that the Communist Party would be particularly happy about. And so you basically have, therefore, three big stressors in the US-China relationship over the next year. One is a potential visit by Kevin McCarthy to Taiwan. A second is US rhetoric about China in the presidential election cycle. And then a third is Taiwan's own election. We know all those three things are going to happen in 2023. What we don't know is the things that we can't count on that I'm sure will pop up, right? Do we have some crisis because there's a military incident that occurs, right? Does China do something that worsens the relationships? We don't know that. But we know for sure that there are going to be three big stressors in the relationship. So I think 2023 is going to be an incredibly difficult year. I think the Chinese and the US government are both aware of that as well. And that's why they tried a few days ago to set a floor under the relationship, to actually, try and establish some connections so the two sides can talk a little bit. Right now, ties between the two sides are not great, and most of our interlocutors are basically gone. They got cleared out in the changeover in the Party Congress. So the two people that the United States has relied on the most in China over the last 5 years are on the economic relationship, a guy named Liu He. He aged out. He probably should have aged out a little while ago in China's system, but he had hung on. But Liu is now gone, and we don't know who his replacement is on the Chinese side to be our main economic interlocutor. And we also, we lost our main foreign policy interlocutor, a guy named Yang Jiechi, who actually had been building an okay relationship with the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. As a result, we basically have entered into a period where we know 2023 is going to be incredibly difficult, but the communications channels between Washington and Beijing are maybe more broken than they've been, at least in any time that I can remember. And coming out of the Party Congress, what Washington was hoping to do is get some clarity from Xi Jinping, number one, about where he wants the relationship to go, but also about who it is that we're supposed to be dealing with in the Chinese system when we want to get things done. So I think the good news is the meeting between Xi and Biden seems to have gone fairly well, or at least it didn't go badly. There weren't screaming matches. The bad news is it hasn't fixed any of these structural problems in the relationship, and those are probably going to remain for the foreseeable future. So that's why I think 2023 is a particularly difficult year. Now, we were talking on the way over, if any of you listened to the debate in Washington, the debate in Washington is not actually about 2023, it's about the year 2027. Because a variety of people have suggested that for some reason Xi Jinping might decide in 2027 that he's going to invade Taiwan. I will put my marker down and say I think there's very little evidence for this argument. The argument goes something along the lines of Xi Jinping will invade Taiwan when he feels confident that he has the capabilities to do so, and he's aiming to do so in 2027. But I think basically every one of those assertions isn't upheld by much evidence. We don't have a lot of evidence that Xi Jinping thinks he's going to be capable of taking Taiwan in 2027. We have very little evidence that suggests that even if he thought he could take Taiwan at some level of risk, that he would actually execute that kind of operation. In fact, what I think is much more likely is that Xi Jinping is reacting to events, and not that he's going to act opportunistically, but that actually he will act if he feels backed into a corner. And so the question is, what might back Xi Jinping into a corner? And this is why I think 2027 isn't the logical period to be worried about. Actually, for me, I would be much more worried right now about 2023 than 2027, because we've got the three events coming up that I just mentioned. A visit from Kevin McCarthy, which is going to put Xi Jinping in a position where he feels he has to respond. We saw this with the Nancy Pelosi visit. Rhetoric in the United States about China and potentially about Taiwan is part of the presidential campaign that will make Xi Jinping feel that he has to at least respond to some degree in kind. and then a Taiwan election where it's not completely inconceivable that you could get some pretty mainstream candidates in Taiwan talking openly about independence or a referendum or something of those sorts. I think it's not the most likely outcome, but it's not impossible to imagine. So I think, unfortunately, the debate we've had in Washington is about 2027 being a challenging time period, and yet the time period we have right in front of us, the next year, is probably going to be potentially even harder than anything that would be in 2027. So that's my reason to be concerned. Now let me give you my reason why maybe we can be a little bit hopeful. So a lot of my academic research is about rising and declining powers and their views of rise and decline. And it turns out that most countries are pretty terrible, and most leaders are pretty terrible at telling when they are rising and declining, which you've done a lot of thinking and writing about this as well. So it turns out the United States has been terrible at this in our history, right? If you go back and you look at some of the best books on rise and decline of great powers, for example, published in 1986, the view in 1986 was that the United States was in terminal decline, right? We know now that actually the Soviet Union at the time was in terminal decline. The United States 5 years later would be arguably at the peak of its power in the recent post-war system, right? So we've been pretty bad at telling when we're declining. And rising powers are often not great at telling when they're rising either. You could tell the same story about the US in the 1880s when the US felt that we were pretty weak, all things considered. And in fact, if you look at all kinds of power dynamics, we were much stronger than we thought we were. So what we worry about in academic, parlance is these power transitions, especially the perceived transition when one power thinks that it is getting weaker over time. Because when you get weaker, you have an incentive to move now, right? To do something now. So some of my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute have written a book called Danger Zone recently, which I will now attack. They're good friends of mine. But I think the book is wrong. And the argument they make is that, in fact, the United States is rising, that China is declining, and that fundamentally the transition that many of us think is going to happen is not going to occur, right? And they cite a bunch of evidence. You can look at Chinese demographics, which are pretty terrible, right? You can look at the slowdown in Chinese growth over the last year or two, which has been, I think, probably much worse than is being reported. A lot of my friends who are bankers in Hong Kong will tell you that actually the growth numbers for this year in China could be negative. They're definitely under 2%. I think the government is going to report something closer to 3 or 4% at the very least. So so there is evidence that there is real challenge in China, to say nothing of the political challenges, which we can talk about. But my own personal view is that Xi Jinping has made the Chinese system much more fragile than it has been in recent memory, and that therefore China might not actually continue to rise, and also that the United States is renewing itself and is going to be much stronger in, say, 2030 than the United States is today. So if you thought this was the case, then China would have a huge incentive to act now or to act in the next couple of years on Taiwan, right? Because if China were to think that it is going to get weaker and weaker, every year that goes by, China is not going to be as strong, then it has to try and attain its objectives now. It can't wait till 2030 or 2040 or 2049, as some would have it. And so the argument goes that China is going to act now to try and change the status quo. And in fact, this would be another reason to think that 2023 is going to be a particularly difficult year. But let me now try and rebut this argument. I think if you go and ask your friends or colleagues in China, what trajectory they think China is on, you'll get a totally different story. And I will admit that some of this may be intended to influence, views among Americans. But I will tell you, when I talk to Chinese officials or Chinese experts, I get no sense that China is declining from them. The sense I get is maybe that China has had a bit of a speed bump the last year, and that COVID-19 is slowing down Chinese growth in a very short-term manner, but that China is going to be back running fast in a couple of years. So my friend Jude Blanchett, who Danny knows from CSIS, likes to say that this is kind of like a bodybuilder with a cold, right? So it's not that China's getting weaker, it has to get through this cold, and then it'll be back to normal, right? And getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So what really matters, after all, right, is not how much power the US has or how much power China has, it's the perceptions of that power. And so if Chinese leaders think that China is still getting stronger, they actually don't have a lot of incentive to move now on Taiwan or any other issue. They might as well wait. And not only do I think Chinese leaders tend to think that China is getting stronger, I also think they tend to believe that the United States is getting weaker, right? So when I talk to my friends in China and to a lot of academics, they look at the political process in the United States and they think the US is basically collapsing. We can talk about this if you'd like. I work at the American Enterprise Institute, which is I don't know what we'd say now. It used to be a conservative place. I have lots of strong views on this, but I tend to think that the American political system is in some pretty serious challenges, right? I don't think the Chinese are entirely wrong about this. But what's interesting, right, is that this is the opposite of the narrative that you would expect to hear from China if my colleagues are right that we're in a danger zone. The narrative you would expect to be hearing from Chinese experts is in fact that they would be very worried about China, right? And very worried about the direction that China is going in. They wouldn't be confident in China's growth trajectory. And the same thing is true in the United States, right? So I think if you talk to people in the Biden administration, they think the United States is in great shape, right? So, I mean, the president has just said this recently. He said it to Xi Jinping when they met a few days ago, right? He thinks that the United States is renewing itself, that the midterms show that democracy is succeeding in the United States, that actually the American economy is really strong compared to the rest of the global economy right now, right? And it's true. If I'm right about Chinese growth numbers, this is the first time in 40 years that the United States is going to grow faster than China economically. And oh, by the way, it wasn't close for the rest of that time, right? Like about the closest it's been in that 40 years is like 3.5% growth in the United States and like 9% growth in China, right? And this is a reversal, so the Biden team is going to say that. And so we're in this very strange period where what the academics would tell you would be the most risky period is when both sides think that time is on the other's side. In other words, the Chinese think that the US is getting stronger and the US thinks that China is getting stronger. That's really dangerous because both sides then have a huge incentive to move now before they themselves get weaker. But I think the world we're in is actually what we might call like a doubly safe world. For some reason, both China and the United States think that they are each in really strong positions and might be getting stronger in the years ahead, right? Now, the thing that I worry about is that we can't both be right. So either the United States is getting stronger or China is getting stronger, but one of us is wrong. And I think the really dangerous period, therefore, is probably when you see a change in perception in either China or in the United States about the future power trajectories, right? So if China were to really see substantially slower growth that they thought was going to slow down over not just a year or two, but decades, I think that would fundamentally change how Chinese leaders have to think about how they operate now, right? if you don't think that you can solve the Taiwan problem, as they might say, in 2049 because you won't be strong enough, maybe you do have to solve it now. Right? On the other hand, if you're the United States and you think that you're going to be weaker 5 or 10 years from now than you are today, then we also have some incentives to take some actions now that I think would be destabilizing. But the bottom line is, and I'll leave it here and just really look forward to the discussion, I think we're in this particularly strange period where we've convinced ourselves that actually we are in the danger zone. But right now, we're actually in about the sweet spot. We're in the only time that political scientists feel pretty confident when both sides have an incentive to wait. And yet we're entering 2023, which is going to be, I think, a difficult year. So my bottom line is that I think it's actually pretty positive that Xi Jinping and Joe Biden are trying to manage the relationship in a more serious way now. They haven't solved any of these structural problems, but I think the good news is that until these perceptions change, we probably have, we can be a little bit more confident that we're not going to end up in a major crisis or a major conflict. But I think what we all should be watching for is this change in perceptions, either in Washington or in Beijing, about the growth trajectories of both countries. And when that happens, I think all bets, unfortunately, could be off, particularly if the views in China are the ones that change, right? Because China is, by nature of being a rising power, the one that would have to revise the status quo to lead most likely to a major conflict. So why don't I leave it there and just really look forward to the discussion with everyone. Thanks.
Great. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions first while folks in the room maybe collect your thoughts. And then since it's such a small room, I might just ask you to take your own questions unless you'd like to.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so 2 questions. The first, I was curious if you could be more specific about what you think the stressors look like. Because from the conclusion of the presentation, it actually seems that the stressors aren't that big a deal. So why be really worried about 2023 if at the end of the day we're in a doubly safe world? Yeah. The second is, so the thing, I mean, the power projection stuff, it's great, but one of the inadequacies with the argument I find often is it's less that you need a change in perception about the nature of the trend, and more that at some point, whatever the trend has bought you is not in sync with the bargain that's being offered you from the other side. So I guess in like more concrete terms, what does this mean? It means that at some point, China will achieve a level of probability of winning in a scenario of the Taiwan Straits that is not commensurate with the United States offer, which is probably always going to be no deal. Yeah. And that's really the pathway to a conflict in my mind, as opposed to this change of perception. So yeah, that's more of a statement. But what do you?
More of a statement than a question. Yeah. No. So I agree. So I think let me take the second part first because I think this is really important. So I think part of what's really hard here is we just don't know how Xi Jinping thinks about most of the big questions that we're asking. And I think actually, I don't know anybody that's confident. Well, I know a couple people that say they're confident, and those are the people that I know definitely don't know what's going on, right? When I talk to my Chinese friends, including like very senior scholars, the first thing they will say is they have no idea what goes through Xi Jinping's mind. They used to have more access to the leadership, but now, you know, that's no longer the case. Even for very senior, very important academics, most of them, I think, tend not to have a lot of confidence that they understand exactly what's going on in the Chinese system. And even if they understood what's going on in the Chinese system, understanding what's going on in Xi Jinping's mind is a totally separate thing, right? And I think actually most of this comes back to what's going on in Xi's mind, which is really, really difficult. But let me then having acknowledged that I have no idea, hazard some guesses because I think we have to. And let me caveat this also by saying, I'm quite sure that if you ask the most senior US government folks with the best access to all of our information about China, that they also basically don't know, right? And this is why the Xi-Biden meeting is so important, because it is the only way that we can find out what Xi Jinping is thinking, is to actually have Joe Biden talk to him. We can't ask his people because there's not a lot of trust with them and we're not sure that they really know. So we have to talk to Xi. And so these are the questions that we're trying to get some answers on. My guess is that Xi Jinping is going to have a really hard time having enough confidence that he can carry off an invasion of Taiwan to be willing to risk it. And here's why. Because if the invasion goes badly, Xi Jinping is probably dead, right? And maybe if he's really old, it doesn't matter. But let's, if you play this out, right? If Xi Jinping launches an invasion of Taiwan and the invasion fails, this is the great rejuvenation that he's promised, and yet he hasn't been able to accomplish it. And if I were Chinese leadership, I'd be saying, well, maybe we need a different approach, right? Maybe Xi Jinping thought has taken us as far as we can go. So if I'm Xi Jinping, I think the barrier to action is quite high. I would have to be really confident that this is going to work. And I don't know how confident you could be. Now, I'm not saying that he's not going to be confident that it will work. I'm just saying if I were in his shoes, here are some reasons that I wouldn't be confident. Number one, if you've learned anything from the last, 9 months in Ukraine, it's that dictators sometimes get really terrible advice from their militaries, right? And increasingly, China is a personalist dictatorship, right? It didn't used to be that way. It used to be a party system where actually I think you would have gotten some better information potentially. But that's not what it is. And in fact, Xi Jinping, and you know 1,000 times more than I do about this, but Xi Jinping is putting his stamp on the Central Military Commission and really putting his own people in. These are not necessarily people that are going to tell him exactly what the truth is. They may tell him what he wants to hear, just like the Vladimir Putin's generals appear to have told him that Ukraine was going to fall in 2 or 3 days. So number one, if I was Xi Jinping, I wouldn't really trust my military when they say, no problem, boss, we can do this. Number two, if you thought invading Ukraine was hard for the Russian military, which had Ukraine surrounded on 3 borders and had been fighting a war with the Ukrainians for 7, 8 years, wait till you do an amphibious invasion, right? So I started my career as a defense planner in the Pentagon, and by far the hardest thing to do in terms of defense operations is an invasion, an amphibious invasion, over a large body of water. And oh, by the way, in this case, you're doing it against Taiwan, which hasn't been doing all the things it should be doing to prepare, but has had 70 years to think about this main scenario. And you might have to fight the world's #1 largest military and the world's #3 largest economy in Japan at the same time. Like, this is tough. This is not an easy operation. And then the third reason I think I would be wary if I were Xi Jinping is the last time his military fought a real war was 1979, and they lost. So I'd be pretty cautious if I were Xi Jinping, given the downside risk if he loses. But I think the logic you lay out is exactly right. If he gets to the point where he thinks that he can adjust the status quo at an acceptable cost, I think there's some risk. But that's why I worry less about opportunism than some people do, and I worry much more about Xi Jinping being backed into a corner and feeling that he has no other choice but to take military action, right? Because if he's backed into a corner, all of these calculations about odds may not matter. He may have to do it anyways, right? So that's sort of how I think about this. Remind me again the first part,
So the first part was about 2023.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So my point on 2023 is I think the good news is, for the reasons I laid out, I don't think China has an incentive to invade Taiwan now, right? So I think actually Xi Jinping is probably not thinking about invading at all, despite all the rhetoric that you hear in Washington about an invasion being imminent. It could be, days or months away, right? Like, you get military officers saying this stuff all the time. You get senior U.S. government people saying this stuff all the time. In fact, I don't think there's much evidence that China is planning to do anything in 2023 like an invasion. But I think there is some danger that we will back the Chinese into a place where they feel they have to take military action. It might not be an invasion, but where they have to do something to signal their displeasure at the direction that things are going.
So akin to 95, 96 or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what some of, there are a lot of dialogues between American and Chinese officials or experts. And in many of those dialogues, my Chinese academic friends, many of whom were educated here in the US by John Mearsheimer and great realists here, they will say, one lesson we've learned is that the United States and Taiwan haven't gotten the message. China is stronger than it used to be, and we can't be pushed around. We tried to send that message when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and if Kevin McCarthy thinks that he can just visit Taiwan without having serious repercussions, then we're going to have to remind him that that's not the case. So it's not that I think the Chinese are planning for some sort of invasion, but I do think that they will feel that they have to take some tough actions to show how serious they are on the Taiwan issue.
So we'll open it up now. Zach, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Hi Zach, my name is Beenish. Thank you so much for your talk. It was great to learn about these stressors specifically, and I have two questions. You talked a lot about the economic growth aspect of the competition, and there's two other aspects that I kind of want to probe your thinking a little bit further on. The first is about strategic partnerships. So how is the Chinese thinking about balancing against the US kind of outreach to building strategic partnerships, especially in relation to the Quad and the AUKUS? I know that some of it is we want to do more economic stuff, but there's obviously a lot of strategic and military undertones within these partnerships and transfer of technology, which is really concerning. So what is the thinking on that? And then the second aspect I want to probe you a little bit further in terms of, have we really reached the sweet spot, or is it still in a danger zone, is the nuclear element of this kind of rivalry. Especially when you think about the Chinese developments and the growth that has been happening, the ICBM forces that have been recently uncovered, as well as the ability that there's speculation about the strategic breakout capacity that China is trying to build to maintain some sort of parity with the US. How is this factoring into the relationship? Is this where you see a lot more sweet spot, or is there a growing competition which is concerning? Why? And then how does this tie into this? You mentioned in 2027, people are predicting that China might want to take over Taiwan. How does the nuclear element factor into this 2027 versus right now thinking? So those are my questions. Thank you so much.
They're great questions, and I'll look forward to others' views on these too. So let me say on the first question, I think what's really, this is going to be a very broad brush characterization, but I'll do it anyways. So I think the way the US is increasingly thinking of the competition with China globally is, we don't say this, but is through kind of an East-West lens, right? We think of this in kind of the same way we thought about the Cold War. They're the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys are basically the same good guys. The bad guys are kind of similar bad guys in the way a lot of people in Washington think about this. So what's the grouping the US is using the most? It's the G7, right? All the time. The G7 is doing everything. Economic stuff, which is kind of what it was supposed to do. It's doing political messaging. Sometimes it does some military stuff. Tech, democracy, it's all in G7, right? And the G7 is a pretty coherent group, a bunch of advanced industrialized democracies, a pretty significant portion of world GDP. The problem is that actually I don't think that's at all how the Chinese see the world. I think they see the world more through a north-south lens than an east-west lens. And where I think the Chinese government has been making a lot of progress is in the global south, right? So we just had a G20 meeting, and if you look at those G20 members and you listen to what narratives are coming out of Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, these are totally different stories than what you hear from the G7, right? They don't think that there's a clear rules-based order that everyone is following. They think actually the world is multipolar and it's much more complex and competitive. And so I think what you're seeing is two fundamentally different approaches and driven by different logics in Washington and Beijing. And this is a particularly fascinating week from my perspective to be thinking about this, because for most of the last 3 years, actually China hasn't been doing that much engagement globally, right? I mean, Xi Jinping hasn't really left China. This is his first major trip outside. Very few major foreign leaders have come to China. And now you had the German Chancellor just in Beijing. You have Xi Jinping meeting and even smiling with lots of foreign leaders, which is a little rare. I think what we're seeing now is China's going to be doing a real charm offensive the next 6 months. We know that Xi Jinping is probably going to Saudi Arabia, which is a big step for him. But I think that's sort of just the beginning of this. So I think the competition in terms of sort of global alignment is increasingly that the US is solidifying this core around the G7 and some other mini-lateral groups that handle these functional issues, right? AUKUS, mentioned the Quad. There's something called the sort of Chip 4 or Fab 4 Alliance on Technology Supply Chains. So there's some of these groupings, but the US groupings all tend to be with kind of like-minded states, right? A lot of European and then a handful of Asian players, maybe Japan, Australia, sometimes Korea, sometimes India, sometimes Taiwan. But basically, there's no one in Latin America, no one in Africa, almost no one in Southeast Asia that's a part of those groupings. And I think the Chinese have recognized that and are trying to make a fair amount of progress in convincing those countries that China is a reliable partner and to offer those countries something positive. So I think it's a really fascinating period, and at some point, again, we can't both be right about who's going to make the rules going forward, right? My guess is that the Chinese are more right than the United States is, and that the United States has to sort of shift its approach pretty fundamentally. But we'll see if we're capable of doing that. On the nuclear side, yeah, I hosted 2 years ago the rollout of something called the China Military Power Report. So every year, the Pentagon comes out with a report on China that says, here are all of China's capabilities on the military side. And basically, for as long as any of us can remember, the nuclear side says, boy, China really has a very minimal nuclear force. Like, if we were planning China's nuclear force, we would never do this because it's far too risky. We would have way more nuclear weapons. We don't know why they don't have more nuclear weapons, but hey, good for us. So 2 years ago, the Pentagon said that China had a number of deployable nuclear warheads in the low 200s, which is pretty low considering that we were in the many thousands in the Cold War and are now at the 1,500 level with the Russians. The new estimate last year was that in 2030, China's going to have 1,000 nuclear warheads deployable. And there's rumor that the new number might be in 2027, which you mentioned, that they might have 1,000. So this is a pretty massive buildup in a very short amount of time. Again, trying to guess what's going on in the heads of Chinese leaders is a little difficult, but since you asked, I will hazard some thoughts. I think the idea for a long time in China was that nuclear war was almost unthinkable, and therefore it wasn't worth putting a lot of resources into nuclear weapons. I think the only explanation for why we see China investing in this buildup is that nuclear war is a little less unthinkable than it used to be. And oh, by the way, I think that's certainly something that lots of people are thinking about right now is the Russians make lots of nuclear threats, right? So I would expect that we might even see this buildup accelerate in China. And it's not just the number of nuclear weapons they have, right? It's that they're building hundreds of silos out in the west to house intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're building a more advanced submarine-launched ballistic missile and a submarine to deliver it. And they're building a cruise missile that can be fitted on a bomber aircraft that would be also an advancement. So it's both the number of capabilities and it's the type of capabilities. Now, I'm not panicked about this because, so for a long time, just two more words on this and then I'll stop. For a long time, the US has not acknowledged what we call mutual vulnerability with China. So we've said basically that we don't publicly say that we think China has a secure second strike. In other words, we're kind of suggesting that we think it might be possible for us to launch a first strike nuclear attack and take out all of China's nuclear forces. We're not saying that. But in the Chinese view, why wouldn't we acknowledge vulnerability to the Chinese nuclear forces? It's only if we don't actually think we're vulnerable. And so one thing that Chinese experts said a lot to some of us after the invasion of Ukraine was Joe Biden keeps talking about how he's not putting US troops in Ukraine because Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. Got it. So you're saying if we had a lot of nuclear weapons that you wouldn't fight for a non-treaty ally like, say, Taiwan, right? So I'm not saying that that's the logic behind this, but PLA military officers or retired PLA military officers, they very often will say, they will make that argument. And I think it's something new that we're gonna have to deal with. I don't think it requires us to change our whole nuclear approach, but we're entering a different world where, for a long time it's only been Russia and the US that had parity on nuclear weapons, and that's not where we are anymore.
Thank you.
All right, sorry for the long answer. Dan.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. You mentioned that both the U.S. and China have pretty optimistic perceptions of their trajectories. I'm wondering, what do you think third-party countries what their perceptions are about their trajectory, and how does it affect their alignments, whether it's hedging, balancing, things like that?
So I think third parties think both the United States and China are heading in crazy directions and probably going down the wrong path. And they might both be right, right? I think the read you get on China from a lot of the foreign government officials, non-Chinese, that I talk to is, boy, 10 years ago, collective leadership may not have been perfect, but the Chinese political system had a way to fix mistakes. Now it doesn't, right? The Chinese economy was still growing. We knew it was going to slow down, but nothing like the slowdown we're seeing now, and nothing like the crackdown on the most innovative parts of the Chinese economy, like the tech sector, that you would have been expecting. A lot of concern that actually the new economic leadership team in China is much less professionalized than the old leadership team, and they may be much less capable of dealing with the real estate crisis or the debt crisis that China has. And so I hear a lot from foreign officials that they are very worried about the long-term path that China is on for political reasons, for economic reasons, and that China's wolf warrior diplomacy, right, this trend of going out very confidently and asserting China's interests has done huge damage to China in some areas abroad, right? And I'll give you an example, which is Korea. The Korean public, if you look at polling data, is more concerned about China than the American public is. Huge change in the last 5 years, and mostly due to Chinese government behavior. And that's been true in a lot of European countries as well. You can see this rapid downturn around 2018, 2019. I think it starts around Hong Kong and Xinjiang revelations and things like that. So I think a lot of the views of China outside of China are really negative. I also think a lot of the views of the United States are really negative. I mean, most of my work is on US alliances and partnerships. And we were just talking about nuclear weapons. Now, South Korea, again, they really want nuclear weapons. Is it because they're terrified of China? Not so much. Is it because they don't trust the United States, their treaty ally? Yeah. Right? And there's not a lot the Biden administration can do to convince countries like South Korea that the United States is going to be a reliable partner, because the South Koreans, even if they might not fully trust the Biden team, they feel like they've got some rapport. But what they're terrified about is Donald Trump coming back, right? And there are a lot of countries like that, like most of our allies in Europe and most of our allies in Asia, right? For whom Donald Trump was pretty clear, he didn't really have any deep affinity. And so I think the challenge that we have now is, I think a lot of these third-party countries, they look at the direction that China's going and they don't want to go in that direction, right? They look at the direction the United States is going and they think that we have a lot of our own domestic challenges. And neither of those approaches seems particularly appealing. So my personal view is that we're heading into a multipolar world. We're already in a multipolar world, and we're heading into a more multipolar world because most of these countries don't want to sign up for whatever Washington or Beijing are selling. Some countries will, of course, but most will want to go their own way. And I don't think that people in China or in the United States have fully come to grips with that reality.
Thanks for your talk. It was really thought-provoking. I'm Don. So, two questions. One is about the announcement yesterday that the U.S. and China are going to restart climate cooperation, or like trying to make a deal or whatever. What do you make of that? And do you make anything of the fact that Kerry and the senior Chinese diplomat who's in charge of climate are reportedly like very close?
Yeah.
Second question would be about what I feel like is maybe the more likely Taiwan scenario that we should be talking about, which is, yeah, so, McCarthy's visit is incredibly inflammatory, leads to a similar or more aggressive quasi-blockade of the islands that raises tensions to the point where the U.S. has to think about getting involved. To me, that's a conflict spiral that seems like really worrying. So how do you think about likely outcomes there?
Again, great questions. So on climate, I don't think we really know what happened in the meeting. I say that having talked to both sides in the last 24 hours. So the US story of what happened in the Xi-Biden meeting on climate is that we didn't get anything specific in terms of agreements from the Chinese side. The Chinese government story, as recounted to me yesterday, is that there were specific promises made by the Chinese side on climate. I don't know which of those to believe. I tend to go with the American side just because, I know those folks better. My guess is that it may be somewhere in the middle, right? The Chinese side may feel that they made some concessions on climate, and we may feel like they were a bit nebulous. What I will say is, I think Beijing is determined to try and use climate to incentivize the United States to cooperate on other issues. And I think the Biden team has no interest in doing that. So what the Chinese will often say is they want to use issue linkages. Essentially, they won't say this explicitly, but they'll say, well, we can't really cooperate on climate if we don't have trust in the whole rest of the relationship. Of course, they said the opposite thing a few years ago, which I find amusing, right? So it used to be that they said, when Donald Trump was putting on tariffs, they used to say, well, just because we have a little disagreement on intellectual property stuff doesn't mean that we can't do things in the rest of the relationship. We shouldn't issue link across from one thing to another. And now they say, well, of course we're issue linking. Like, we're not going to do anything on climate or North Korea or these other issues if we don't have trust in the relationship. So I think the Chinese are always going to hold out this possibility of cooperation on climate change as a way to try and persuade the Biden administration to cooperate on other issues. And the Biden team is not going to do that. And so my guess is that we're going to see John Kerry engage more with China, that he will have very little leverage with the Chinese because they don't have a lot of incentives to cooperate with John Kerry because they're not going to get anything from us in non-climate areas in return. That's just not how this is going to go. So it so happens that a good friend of mine handles the U.S.-China relationship at the White House. She's not going to give China something because we got something on climate. That's just not how this is going to go. And they've been very clear with the Chinese about this. So my guess is that we're pretty stuck on climate issues. And there have been some arguments made recently that actually, even we talk often about elements of the relationship that are competitive and elements that are cooperative. And we say, oh, Taiwan is a competitive area, but climate's a cooperative area. You have to work together. I think there's some arguments that actually climate is in many ways competitive, and that the arguments we're going to be making are that, you know, like we're doing more than China is, or China's not doing enough, and there's going to be some competition over demonstrating seriousness on climate. So it may not be fully cooperative anyways as a domain. So I don't think we're going to get far anytime soon on climate, unfortunately. On Taiwan, I think you're exactly right that the path into a real crisis is exactly as you describe it. Now, the good news here is that the Biden team is very responsible and they don't want a big crisis. They don't want a conflict. And I think they managed the Pelosi visit I think they made a lot of mistakes early, but after it was clear that Nancy Pelosi was going to Taiwan, I think they managed it fairly responsibly. And I'm on record as having said that I thought Pelosi's visit was a mistake for Pelosi. So, you know, I guess it won't surprise then that I thought that we shouldn't overreact to what Beijing did. Of course, we all knew that China was going to react pretty harshly to Pelosi's visit. I'm not excusing it, but I'm saying this was obvious to everyone. So it should be obvious that they're going to react pretty harshly to McCarthy's visit when he goes as well. And I think the Biden team will be pretty responsible. They understand that she is going to take some actions, and they will probably let him do some things, as long as they don't think that this is leading to a conflict. Now, if they think this is the prelude to an invasion or an actual blockade or something like that, I think you will see a flip switch overnight on the U.S. side, and we will go from being somewhat accommodating of the Chinese need to show toughness to being very, very tough ourselves. If we thought that the Chinese were not just doing some posturing in response to a visit. But I agree with you. I think whenever that visit happens is going to be a very tense time. And just a final thought, which is who knows what the odds of conflict are. I said I thought when Speaker Pelosi went that the odds were 20% that we ended up in a major crisis. I think that's probably about right again. Just because by its very nature, having all of these forces, US forces, Taiwan forces, Chinese forces, some Japanese forces, all operating really closely together, it's just inherently risky. There's a famous line from a movie that like 5 of you are old enough to remember now, called The Hunt for Red October, where a former senator says, this business will get out of control, it'll get out of control and we'll be lucky to live through it. And that's sort of my view of this is like, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, there's a carrier strike group or two with US military members on them, really hoping that like there isn't an inadvertent radar lock or something of that sort, right? And these things happen, people make mistakes. So do I think a conflict is likely over McCarthy's visit? No. But is the risk of an incident zero? Absolutely not, right? And we have a whole litany of incidents in the US-China relationship that show that that's the case. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Charles. Thank you very much for
Yeah, of course.
I remember seeing that the Biden administration during the meeting offered vaccines to China.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? And then, what do you think more about like cooperation over pandemic preparedness, like both for future pandemics and also COVID response going forward in the future between?
Yeah. So I'm very pessimistic about cooperation cooperation on health issues, unfortunately, which is really bad because my personal view is, if you look at any of the pandemic data, right, there's a pretty high likelihood that the next pandemic is going to come out of a place like China, right, or the Mekong River Delta. Just by the nature of where diseases tend to erupt, this is a frequent location. And so you would really want to be doing health monitoring and cooperative efforts of this sort. I have no idea where COVID-19 came from and what the story is. I think the idea, however, that we're going to be doing any substantial cooperation with the Chinese on health issues like this in the future is hard for me to imagine, for both the Chinese side and for the American side. I mean, I don't think this is a great idea, but I think we're heading into a world where Republicans are going to be doing hearings about COVID-19, where it came from, what the US response was, how the United States had invested in labs in Wuhan. Republicans have explicitly said that they're about to call hearings on this, right? This is going to be extremely politicized. There's no way that the Chinese in that world are going to be wanting to work with us on health issues. Now, I think the Chinese government has made a huge mistake on mRNA vaccines, right? So just a word on the terrible spots that China's in on COVID, right? They have driven themselves in a cul-de-sac on COVID that is really hard to get out of. They said that Sinovac and Sinopharm, their domestically made vaccines, were really effective when we know that they're not. So I have some friends that got Sinovac and Sinopharm and then went to doctors and tested their antibodies, and they had 0 antibodies against COVID, right? But the Chinese government told its people that these were basically the same as mRNA vaccines. So Chinese people had no incentive to think that mRNA vaccines were good or worth getting, and the Chinese government decided not to invest in getting them at all. So now we are 3 years into a pandemic where China's done an incredible job at locking down and avoiding most people getting COVID, but now has people, some of whom have been vaccinated, many of whom do not want to get vaccinated, including elderly. And unlike the rest of the world, has basically no natural immunity left to COVID, right? So if you just run the numbers based on projections out of the deaths in Hong Kong, if the Chinese government opens up and lets COVID run rampant the way it does here, you're probably talking about like 5 million dead, right? Could be worse. It's a lot of dead people for a government that has staked its reputation in the last few years on being better at managing the pandemic than the West. And the only answer out of this cul-de-sac is somehow to get your hands on mRNA vaccines. And I think the path forward, and I think this is why the German Chancellor was in Beijing, is to get their hands on German and American-made vaccines, right? Of course, they're not going to have the names of the American and German companies on the side. They're going to be relabeled under some Chinese name and sold so it's not clear exactly where the mRNA vaccines came from, or that these are the mRNA vaccines that the Chinese said 2.5 years ago weren't important. But for that reason, I just can't see us doing any substantial cooperation on vaccines, and I think this is probably more a public messaging thing on the US side to say, look, we tried to offer you mRNA vaccines and you didn't accept them, and now millions of people die in China, it's not our fault. So I think health cooperation, it's just like I was saying on climate, people talk about health and climate being cooperative areas. I think everything right now in the US-China relationship is competitive. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I just think that's the reality.
Wouldn't it be a positive,
No.
Wouldn't it be a positive outcome if they were to take the mRNA vaccines from the US and Germany and relabel them, or are you saying that that's not likely to happen?
I think it will happen. I think that's essentially what the Germans have agreed to do. I think it's really positive for the world, it's positive for Chinese that they're going to have access to mRNA vaccines, right? And I think just as humans, we should want 5 million people to die in China when most of those people should be capable of getting vaccines that would save them. Now, let's be clear, I don't know how many people will actually get vaccinated in China. Uptake in Hong Kong, even among elderly, is really low, right? People just don't think it's important. And so even if China does get good mRNA vaccines and gets a lot of them, right? I mean, talking like 2.5 billion doses, maybe more, and administers them, we're still talking, I don't know, a year before there's substantial immunity in China. And that's assuming that, the virus doesn't fundamentally shift in that time period. So there's huge risk here either way. But yeah, I think it's obviously good for Chinese people if they get functional mRNA vaccines. I think the only downside from my perspective is China has real problems with intellectual property theft. And I do think this is an area where, at some point, China should just acknowledge that there's technology from outside that they would like to have access to. And that actually, this could have been a cooperative area. Like, I actually do think the US would have given vaccines, lots of vaccines to China, if they'd been willing to not relabel them. So, do I think we should give them? Absolutely. Am I frustrated that the Chinese are more worried about labeling than they are about deaths of large numbers of Chinese? Yeah. I think it's emblematic of where the government's going, right? Which is that control is priority number one. And I think that's a bad sign. But yeah, I think we should be sharing vaccines to the extent the Chinese are willing to take them. Sorry, so I hand over here.
Hey, Zach. I'm Reed Pauly. I'm a professor here at Brown. I apologize for missing the beginning of your remarks, but I think you're very well positioned to shed some additional light on how you know these kinds of things as an analyst in the United States. You made some comments about the closure of the Chinese system and how it's making it even hard to do intelligence collection. But we're now, for COVID reasons, many years into a lack of access of American scholars to even travel to China to learn more about their views on all the crisis opportunities you've mentioned. How do you see that affecting the community that you're a part of, right? Whether it's in Washington or just around the United States, the inability of people to travel to China, how has that changed? Does it result in we know less, therefore we fear more kind of misperceptions? Or do you see just a lot more backing off in terms of what we can be confident that we do know? How is this affecting people like you who clearly are still talking to your Chinese counterparts but have an inability to interface?
It's a fascinating question. So there are people in the room who have a lot of experience on this, more personal than mine. So let me just give you my thought, and I don't know if others want to jump in. I think this is doing tremendous damage to both sides. When I talk to my Chinese counterparts who are academics or think tank researchers, they seem like they don't understand the United States to me anymore. And these are people who, in many cases, were educated in the US. Like, many of us went to school with them. Like, we know them really well. They lived here. They know the US really well. But they don't understand what's happened here the last few years. In many cases, because they haven't been able to travel. They haven't been able to travel outside of China. The propaganda in China is much more active than it used to be, so they're hearing a lot more of that. I mean, these are academics, in some cases, who I think of as friends, who, like, now when we have Zoom meetings, out of nowhere they'll say, and I think they genuinely believe it, that everything the US is saying about Xinjiang is a lie and that there's no one that's been detained there. And if that's really what you believe, you're not going to understand how Americans are thinking about China. Like, these human rights issues are, if you look at the polling data, they're really changing perceptions, not just here, but in Europe and elsewhere. So I think the misperceptions are growing really rapidly because Chinese haven't been here. So I'll give you an example. For the second time in 3 years, I saw a Chinese expert on the street yesterday. The first time was 6 months ago. Same guy, the only person I know that has come to the US that's a top tier academic. They haven't been allowed out, right? And this is someone, like when I was at Princeton, he did a year at Princeton as a scholar. And he's one of their top scholars in the United States. The idea of like randomly seeing him on the street yesterday, I was shocked. Like, what is happening, right? And it used to be, you just see him randomly, because he'd be in Washington all the time. No big deal. So Chinese scholars haven't, I think, have lost touch in many cases with what's happening. And our discussions over Zoom are not the same, right? Chinese feel very watched. So what happens in these discussions is the Americans talk about America and the Chinese talk about America, and no one can talk about China in any level of honesty, so it's not even worth doing. On the other hand, I think most American China experts feel like they've lost touch with some of what's happening in China too. And I mean, you can tell me whether this is fair. So I'm not a China expert, as I said, but I spend a lot of time on the relationship and talking with Chinese experts and government officials. The last time I was in China was 2018. I was there with a group of academics. This group went once a year to Beijing, sort of one of the leading Chinese universities. We met a bunch of top tier Chinese academics. I feel like I might have seen you on one of these trips.
I was there in 2017.
You were there,
Yeah.
it was 17.
Yeah,
Is that where Michael?
No, Michael wasn't on that one.
So-
It was on the 20.
Okay, so the year after this was my last time in China. I remember it well because a guy named Michael Kovrig was there. Michael Kovrig is a Canadian who the Chinese basically picked up and jailed for 2+ years. In response, all the Americans on that trip said we wouldn't go to China until he was freed. Now, I think the Chinese were kind of like, fine, why do we care about you guys anyways? Well, it turns out that the people on that trip that year include the person who wrote the national security strategy for the Biden administration, the person who wrote the Indo-Pacific strategy for the Biden administration, a whole bunch of other senior people in the administration, including the person who's in charge of tech, the person who started out as being in charge on cyber issues for the White House. I mean, like, a large portion of the Biden team, their last trip to China, what they remember most is the Chinese picking up a friend of us not so long thereafter. And that's it, right? And I think that just has to color the relationship in a really negative way. And like, my students don't want to go to China, right? I know a lot of universities have just shut down their centers in China because the students don't want to go. And this was true before COVID. So my view is there's just been tremendous damage done to the relationship. And I'll give you one last example, which is tomorrow there's a group of China scholars who are mostly people who've spent their whole career studying China, right? These are the people who went in the 70s when no one else went to China. If you poll that group, how many of them think they'll be back in China in their lifetimes? Sometimes you get 0, right? These are people who dedicated their whole lives to the US-China relationship and making it good. They lived in China for 10, 20 years in some cases, right? These are like some of the few Americans who speak perfect Chinese. They never think they're going back. I just think this is doing tremendous damage. And those people, they don't feel like they understand China anymore, right? And so the final thing that I'll say on this is, I think the other damage that's being done is that it's undermined the China community's ability to have influence in Washington. Because if the China community isn't sure what's going on in China, then why listen? And I think that's wrong. I actually think the China community really understands most of what's going on in China now. It just took some time to transition to where Xi Jinping has taken China, but actually now, like, the China community is absolutely critical, but that is not the view in Washington. And so I'm just very pessimistic about the path that things are on at the moment, and I think we're to blame for some of it, but to be candid, I think the Chinese system is more to blame. I don't know how much time we have. I don't want to hold
We
people.
have 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Someone has to ask one more question because we gotta end on that note.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
PhD student in political science here. So just building off of that idea that the misperception gap is growing, and you warned about perception as being a problem. What you mentioned that the Biden-Xi meeting is one of the only ways that we can potentially remedy those misperceptions. Moving forward, what would you recommend what other mechanisms other than that very rare leader-to-leader discussion, what other mechanisms from policymakers or in the track 2 level or academics would you recommend for us to try and alleviate these potential misperceptions to reintroduce ourselves to one another?
So I think there are a bunch of things that we should be doing. I think both governments are thinking about some of these measures, but there's opposition to them on both sides. Let me lay out some. Number one, some critiques of the United States here. I think it's crazy that we don't welcome as many Chinese students as want to come to the United States with open arms. I think this is nuts. I think the intelligence collection challenge that we're worried about is minimal. I mean, like, I teach at a university. If I have a Chinese student in my class who's reporting back to the Chinese Ministry of State Security what I'm saying in class, great. It's a waste of their time. That is like, if you want to have a cost-imposing strategy on China, let them report on professors, especially political science professors. This is just a waste of time, right? The Chinese spend a large amount of time hacking my email. They can get anything they want if they really make an effort. Chinese students spying on their faculty. Now, are there certain technology areas that we may want to wall off and be more careful about? Sure. But should we have been letting anyone that wasn't cleared work on those things in the first place? Probably not. That was a bad idea. It had nothing to do with China. And moreover, some of you may not agree with this, but I'll just say, as somebody who thinks we're in a competition and wants to win, I also think the idea that we're going to stop educating 350,000 Chinese a year and demonstrating that there's another form of government that maybe not be perfect, but is an option if things aren't going well in China. My guess is that the Chinese government is actually happy that these students aren't coming to the US in these numbers anymore because they don't get these crazy ideas about other systems that might be different than the Chinese system. So I think just if you were the most hawkish person in the United States trying to come up with a competitive strategy, I think your best strategy would be to ask as many Chinese students as want to come here to come. And oh, by the way, half of them stay. And these are some of the brightest people in China. Half of them stay, right? You're talking about brain drain. There are a lot of people in China doing tech work that don't want to be in China anymore. Boy, wouldn't it be great if we had them here? So look, people-to-people ties like that, right? I think that's a basic. On the Chinese side, they booted out basically every good reporter. So how is it that Americans know about China? I mean, one way is by having excellent reporters there. And Southerners, we have some really, really good reporters on China. Not necessarily Americans, a lot of them were British or Australian or Canadian, but people that have spent their whole life living in China, that could really explain, culturally what was going on, politically what was going on, that had long friendships with people. They've all been booted out. So I think that's really unhealthy, so it makes it a lot harder for us to understand what's happening there. I think some other things that would help, I think we should have dialogues among experts. I don't think those are going to happen in China, and they might not happen in the US.
What about a third country?
Yeah, so that's, I think, where things are headed. The Singaporean government has been suggesting, they're kind of like the new Switzerland, which I think is not so wrong. So I do think some of this will shift to other places, and Singapore is probably the most obvious place. We'll see how candid those discussions are. I think if those discussions are worthwhile, people will take part in I think some Americans are skeptical about whether Chinese are capable of speaking in any of these dialects, right? Like when I go to the Chinese embassy, I don't have useful meetings because the people I'm talking with are surrounded by note takers on either side who are writing not so much what I say, they're writing what their DCM says, so they can report that back. If these are meetings in Singapore with many note takers reporting back to the Ministry of State Security with what Chinese experts are saying, they're not going to be fruitful. Maybe the walks to and from dinners will be fruitful, which is kind of how it always used to be. But even that may be more constrained. So we'll see. And oh, by the way, a lot of these academics are going to tell you they don't know what's going on in the Chinese system anymore anyways, so it's not as useful to talk to them. But I think some resumption of dialogues would be useful. And then I think the final thing I would say is, at the end of the day, there's no replacement for just having some trust in the relationship. And there just isn't trust between the governments now. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, the guy who was ambassador from China to the United States, his name's Qin Gang. He's going back probably to be their new foreign minister. He's been very open with people in Washington that he feels personally slighted by the Biden administration. Our ambassador in China, Nick Burns, has been very open and has said publicly that he feels personally slighted by the Chinese government. Like, these are the people who are supposed to be doing the diplomacy, and they feel like they're left out of the loop. So, a basic start would be to allow the diplomats to actually do the work of diplomats and get out there and talk to people. And I think we'll start to get back there. But just one final thought on this, which is, some of this has to do with changes on both sides, but I think the Chinese have been far too skeptical of the Biden administration. I think the Biden team actually wants to stabilize the relationship. The Chinese have convinced themselves somehow that Biden is personally responsible or behind Pelosi's visit or some of the legislation that they don't like. My view is, having had a little bit of a window into this, that actually the Biden team has been trying to tamp some of this down and make sure it doesn't get out of control. And that therefore, in a world where both sides, bipartisan groups of Congress are pretty anti-China, that the only folks that the Chinese are going to be able to really be able to talk to substantively are in the administration, and it's the Biden team. And so if I were the Chinese, I would double down on really engaging with them in a productive way. I think until this week, it hasn't been clear whether they were willing to do that. And so we'll see if the Xi-Biden meeting actually leads to anything substantive. But maybe the place I'll leave it is, as I said, I think next year could be a really difficult year. So we don't have a lot of time, right? We can't wait. Well, reporters will get in next year, and students will come in 3 years, and everything will be fine. No, I think if we don't have some stability in the relationship by February, we're going to be entering a pretty serious period without guardrails, as the administration likes to say. So we've got to see progress pretty rapidly if we're going to stabilize things.
Well, by soliciting a last question, I hoped that it would be slightly more positive of a note to end on. But nonetheless, it has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for coming. This is our last event this semester, but we have a list of at least 2, perhaps 3 events that we're going to do as part of the speaker series next semester. So look for announcements regarding that. Rory Truex from Princeton is going to be coming, for example. But if you have time and are interested, there's a reception just here, right outside this conference room, where you can ask equally depressing questions to Dr. Cooper over, at least over a beer, or other beverage. So thank you so much for coming, and please join me.